I want to thank everyone for jumping on and participating in our first Investment Insights and Business Strategies session for the year. We typically do 4 to 5 of these a year. As we followed in the past, we cover a market update. Being it's January, we'll give you our market outlook. And then each quarter going forward, we'll update that. And then a special topic. This series beginning topic for 22 is competition for top talent, and it heats up. Those of you running a cooperative, supporting the cooperative, I think everybody is feeling some of the effects of the labor issues that we're experiencing in the country. We're really excited to share this topic with you today as our special segment. So let's get started. The meeting format, once we go through our market update, which I'll spend about 25 minutes, then we'll go into deferred compensation ideas. We have 2 guest speakers, Cindy and Tamika. We're really excited for them to join us. All attendees will be on mute. And if you have questions, which we encourage, there's a Q&A feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This meeting is recorded, and you will get the recording via an email next week. For CEU credits, the proof of attendance will be provided in the post-event email. Those are the administrative tasks, and let's get right into the market review and outlook. I will say that I'm going to cover 2 areas. I'm going to briefly touch on 21 to put a bow on it and talk about some of the trends in 21 that are carrying over into 22, which will give substance to our thoughts on where we see things going. 21, what a rally. Not without its highs and lows, but that steady upward trajectory when we look at Q1 versus Q2. Q3 kind of leveled off, but then we rebounded really strong again at the fourth quarter of 21. The GDP figures just came out for Q4 21, which explains some of that market increase at 6.9%. For the year, GDP was at 5.7%. So that explains why the stock market rallied as strongly as it did. Again, there are different highs and lows throughout each quarter. You see those dips, but overall a steady upward trajectory. And I think that we're going to see that carry forward into 22, not to get ahead of myself, but that type of volatility is what we experience throughout the year. And certainly what we've already experienced in the first 3 weeks of January is going to continue. If we can go to the next slide. It's one of the first times going back to 2001 that we've seen all 11 sectors of the S&P 500 finish with double-digit gains in 21. We had a lot happening in 21. Early part of 21, the recessionary concerns and the market started to take off once those vaccines took hold in our population and people were getting vaccinated. Energy being the leading sector because it had been beaten down so much in 2020. And real estate also performing to 46.19% in 21. So every sector, even utilities, which typically do not participate as strong in an upward market, double-digit growth in 21. So 21 in the record books. What does that mean for 22? If we go to the next slide. Economic recovery slowed down towards the end of 21. I showed that really in the third quarter. It picked up again, but that was due to a couple of things. High inflation, which we'll talk about, and bottleneck in our supply chain that lasted longer than anyone had expected. When we talked in 2020 going into 21, the bottlenecks would have been worked their way out of the system. Originally, people were thinking by mid-21, and then it became the end of 21. Now that we're in 22, it's sometime in 23, hopefully. So they lasted longer than expected. But analysts and we expect the economy to continue to make healthy gains above pre-pandemic levels. But labor costs resulting in inflation, COVID with Delta variant in the latter part of 21, which now we're dealing with Omicron. So we've got all these issues, rising costs of labor. Now we have issues with Europe A lot of things are affecting the economy. The number one concern being inflation, and everybody becoming a Fed watcher when we're thinking about when will the Fed increase rates and how many times will they increase rates. When you look at this slide, you still see that upward economic growth, a little bit flatter than that hockey stick, if you will, but not like we saw in 21, peaks and valleys when we look at individual types of days in the market, and certainly what we've experienced already in the first 3 weeks of January. So if we go to the next slide, what do we see for 22? Expectations, rising rates. That's not an expectation. Chairman Powell all but said that yesterday, that it's no longer a suggestion. We will have higher rates. Could be as soon as March if the inflationary pressures persist. But if we look at GDP growth this year versus last year, we're still predicting healthy GDP growth, just not as much. When we look at the unemployment rate at 4.3% in 21, we're already at 3.9% and trending down. I think 3.7 is the worst case scenario. Some are looking at full employment, which is pegged at 3.5%. Personal consumption inflation is down off of 21, but still higher than in years past. And the same thing with core PCE. But here's the change for rising rates when we look at the Fed funds rate. Now, will it be 3 increases or 4? That's the question that I think what the Fed has said yesterday will be determined based upon how inflation reacts to rate cuts as they get absorbed within the marketplace. Cost of capital, typically, when you raise rates, your cost of capital increases. It affects those sectors that we talked about. Now your mortgage rates go up. The cost of goods and services go up. If you're using credit cards, your credit card debt prices go up. So is that the impetus to slow down the personal consumption rates? And I think that when you look at that in this slide, you'll see that's going to be factored in. It's no longer a suggestion. It's pretty much a fait accompli based upon Chairman Powell's and the Fed's comments yesterday. Next slide, please. Supply chain disruptions were a shift on consumer spending and will continue to be a shift on consumer spending. When we look at that top bar on the left-hand graph are goods, and typically goods coming out of economic concerns, especially 20 through 21, people were not going out and spending money on services, restaurants, hospitality. What they were spending money on was goods, and that's why we saw supply chain issues, because manufacturing slowed down in 2020 and we didn't have inventory on goods and people were not spending money in services. That goods line go up. So where do we see that? You're starting to see it level off as those goods and supply chain issues and rising prices are affected. And hopefully that will be a positive for the servicing component of this. If you look at the right, the delivery time on some of these bottleneck issues, that 20 through 21 coming down as those bottleneck issues get alleviated. Supply chain issues still an issue, but the chart on the right shows that we think those signals of shortages should be starting to ease going forward. Next slide, please. Consumer sentiment versus the S&P 500. The S&P 500, as we showed, and you look at from 2020 to the S&P index, it's again a huge upward momentum, and that's what we experienced. But consumer sentiment has tumbled, and I think that's a result as of the inflationary concerns. Unemployment hit record highs. Why do we have a labor shortage? So consumer sentiment has come down. S&P 500 have gone up. But before the pandemic, these indices generally moved in the same direction. We hadn't experienced a pandemic before. There was a lot of concern that affects consumer sentiment. But The US economy is strong. The US economy did come out of the recession in 21. Earnings are strong in US companies. That's why we saw the S&P 500 move up as it has. We expect that to continue. But we first must address inflation. So let's go to the next slide. The inflation breakdown. This says it all. Year over year, PCE and food, energy, core goods, core services, and shelter, which is your housing, every one of those increasing. And labor being one that we all feel the pain when you had a hiring stoppage, if you will, in 2020, a lot of layoffs in the system, even firms in March and February that had open positions put those on hold throughout 2020 until we got our arms around the pandemic and how to address the pandemic with the vaccines and whatnot. And we've learned a lot. So when 21 hit, all these pent-up jobs went back into the system, as well as companies looking to ramp up production in manufacturing and whatnot. So these labor shortages have persisted. But that affects inflation. So the inflation breakdown is one that we're all experiencing in food, in energy, in core goods and core services, and certainly in housing. It's something that we feel it when we go to the grocery store. But here's the big but. It may look bleak, but it's not that bad when you consider inflation means the economy is strong. We also have to look at from 17 through 21 in this graph, basically price increases have been relatively flat. And I would say that if you go back and we were to extend this chart to 2000 during our cycle, we've had relatively low price increases and labor costs have been relatively flat. So we're experiencing something that a lot of people in the workforce haven't seen in 10 to 12 years, which are labor costs relatively flat, prices of goods and services relatively flat. We're catching up right now because there's a shortage of labor, there's a shortage of materials, we're a shortage which is affecting goods, and we had a pullback in energy, and that's got to get ramped back up. It's not bad to have inflation. Now, if we go to the next slide, we've hit new highs, but those of us that are old, I'll put myself in that camp. If you look from 70 through 79, we have had that uptick recently, but we're in a lot different position today than we were in the 70s. Having lived through the 70s, and I got my start in the early 80s, actually 82, and it's different circumstances. And I know there's a lot of concern out there about, are we going back to the 70s? There are different circumstances today than we experienced in the 70s. Number one, we've got a Federal Reserve that is telegraphing their intentions, where back in the 70s, there was no internet, there was no instantaneous news networks, financial networks. We didn't have the data available, everything lagged. Today, everything is pretty much transparent. And that just goes to show you, if you listen to the Chairman Powell yesterday, things are being telegraphed as best they can. So that surprise element is eliminated, and we're more informed about the data. And if you look at consensus CPI projections on the right-hand side, 4.4 down to more normalized 2.4. These pressures are largely due to supply chain, labor costs. We do expect high inflation for the first half of 22, perhaps into the third quarter of 22. However, we don't think it's back to the 70s. We think it's going to be a little bit smoother into the third and fourth quarter of 22 into 23, but not at the 2% levels. I would say that even within RE Advisors, between our equity team and our fixed income team, we're not 100% in agreement. Equity a little bit more dovish, where fixed income a little bit more hawkish about where inflation will be and how that will come out of it. But perhaps 3 to 4% is not out of the realm of possibility on average for 22 going into 23. So next slide. How do we invest during inflation? We get that question a lot. Even during times of higher inflation, historically, stocks and bonds have generally provided positive returns. Why? Inflation means the economy is strong. When we look at 0 to 2% inflation, where we were for the previous decade plus, we had good, healthy equity returns and good bond returns. Let's look at 2 to 3%, which means the economy is advancing at a faster clip. 14.8, 15% versus 6%. Again, come off a little bit, but again, not bad. Now let's look at 3 to 4%. Now you've got higher interest rates on bonds, higher yield, and equities. Now you're in an overheated perhaps situation. 4 to 6%. That's when fixed income historically outperforms equities. Greater than 6%, that's where equities fall off. And again, if we go to the far left, deflation, where we're less than 0%, it's not healthy for stocks. Again, that's why I said inflation, it's not all that bad. We go to the next slide. Here's the dilemma with the Fed. When this slide was built, analysts expect the Federal Reserve to reverse its quantitative easing policies and begin to raise rates in 22. There are no expectations anymore. The Fed has telegraphed in full transparency to us that rising rates are happening. If we look back in 2020 and even in early 21, the general consensus was that rates weren't going to start increasing towards the end of 23. Here we are in early 22, and we're talking about a March 25 basis point hike. It's already been priced in the bond market on the short end. These telegraphed messages are a done deal. And the question is going to be, here's the dilemma. Is it 3 rate increases? Is it 4 rate increases? I think time will tell throughout this year when and how much we will see from a rate increase. We're expecting 3 rate increases in 22, unless things continue to go on this upward trajectory, perhaps a 4th. We go to the next slide, please. Bond returns differ during rising interest rates environments. 87, having been a portfolio manager during that time period, underperformed in a rising interest rate environment, which was average rate of return in different cycles is at 3.9, almost 4%. 87, we had issues with the market crash. In 86, we also had tax change law in 87, affected rates in a negative way. If you look at 1994 and 95, there was a clear surprise that happened, which we, I think, learned our lesson that we had a 50 basis point rise in Fed fund rate in February of 94. And again, having lived through that, I think the Federal Reserve perhaps learned their lesson to not have surprises to that magnitude where the market reacted negatively. And what we've seen since then are more telegraphed overtures on where rates may be. Rate hikes make some investors nervous. However, rising rates are not necessarily a bad thing. So as I wrap up, next slide. What do we see for 22? If we look back on what we saw for 21, I think we hit every one of our points. So let's see if we can do that again in 22. Higher costs for goods and services. Inflation is here to stay. It's not transitory, but I think we have to put things in perspective. A little inflation is not a bad thing. It did ramp up, but we do think that it's going to level off. Higher wages to keep up with inflation and continued labor shortages. There is a shift in the economy with the types of jobs and where there are shortages. Certainly we're experiencing shortages in some of the jobs that trucking that are affecting cost of goods and services. So rising interest rates, rising yields on bonds as a result of inflation. We're already seeing that priced in the fixed income market. We expect 3 interest rates. I think April, again, now should be changed to March, perhaps another one in August and December. But every 6 weeks, everybody's going to be looking for the Fed's post their meeting. Every 6 weeks they meet and where they see inflation going and what that may affect the next rate increase. We think equity markets will continue to perform positively, but more at a modest pace. And if we look at that 3 to 4% slide that I showed, 5 to 10%, but not without its bumps along the way, which means volatile markets will continue in 22. as we still deal with the pandemic. We will deal with inflation. We've got midterm elections coming up, and we do have global hotspots. So any one of these things that I've outlined here could influence the markets. Another variant, midterm elections changing what has already been priced in the market, a global hotspot, a tinderbox that could explode, obviously the Ukraine. So volatile markets, peaks and valleys, but a continued upward trajectory in 5 to 10% on the S&P. With that, any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple questions here. The first, market volatility has been extremely high in the start of 2022, with continued concern about inflation, the spread of COVID's Omicron variant, and the fact that Ukraine is on the brink of war with Russia. Should investors consider reallocating their portfolios given market volatility?
I think each individual investor has to look at their original investment thesis on how they've allocated in equities, bonds, combination, and look at their liquidity needs. If March of 2020 didn't prove that you spent a lot of time and effort and hopefully working with us to put together an asset allocation plan. A lot of people ran for the hills in March of 2020, but look at how the equity markets performed and fixed income in 2020, and then the equity markets continue into 21. If you have a long-term plan, talk to us and see if your long-term plans objectives have changed. If you have liquidity events coming up throughout this year and you need to adjust your plan, talk to us. But a knee-jerk reaction to inflation or the Ukraine or labor costs, these things happen in the market. We're long-term investors. We take the longer-term view, and obviously that has proven itself out as time goes by.
Another question just came in asking for a little more color on your inflation outlook. Here it is. You say that inflation is here to stay, that it is not transitory, despite how strong the economy is. It seems unrealistic that we can sustain this degree of inflation for a long time. How long do we anticipate inflation remaining above historical levels?
I think put a perspective on what historical levels are. 2% or below is historically low. 2 to 3, 2 to 2 is more the norm, which means that we have a strong economy. I don't have a crystal ball on inflation. We look at what are the causes of inflation. And when we have a decade plus of relatively flat labor costs, relatively flat consumer pricing, consumer goods and services costs going up, that inflation in the 3 to 4%, which is where we are today or where we anticipate 22 to be. Again, this is where the equity team thinks we're back to 2% in 23 or thereabouts, where the fixed income team may be a little bit more, 2.5, 3. But we do think it will come down. We do think that it still takes time as we absorb labor and manufacturing costs and bottleneck issues. But we have a labor shortage, and that's one thing that I don't think we're done yet. But I don't have a crystal ball. I just think that each and every quarter, when we look at the U.S. economy, we'll have to see where the inflationary pressures are coming from, because they evolve and they change. Right now, it's primarily labor and bottlenecks, and hopefully the bottlenecks will dissipate and labor costs will be absorbed in the prices, but those prices, once they're absorbed, will flatten. If you look at real estate, as the cost of capital rises, I pointed this out, mortgage rates go high, so the cost to buy a home will affect people's budget, and maybe people aren't buying houses to the degree they were in 21 and 20, that it's now unaffordable and they stay in the rental market, and that affects the cost of building homes, lumber, piping, electrical work. We have a slowdown in the housing market, which is a big contributor to inflation. As cost of capital increases, not as many people can afford to buy a home given mortgage rates. These things need to be worked in the economy, and those are the tools the Fed has to slow down the economy. But it's threading a needle. It's slowing it down too much where we affect the growth, or is it not slowing it enough where we continue inflation? That's what we're going to see throughout the course of 22.
Those are all the questions we have for now.
Great. If you have other questions, please reach out. Let's change gears. Our special topic today is using deferred compensation plans to create a competitive edge. And if we go to the next slide, we've listened to our members and we had an approach to offering deferred compensation to our cooperatives where NRECA and the INFS group, we provided consulting services and the various types of plans, but the investment option was under the Homestead funds. And a lot of people were, who do I call for this? Who do I call for that? And this has been a 2-year undertaking with myself, Peter Baxter, and Jim Matheson to say, we listened to our members and we needed to create a bundled offering where cooperatives can go to discuss their issues with their talent and how to put a plan in place that's from beginning to end, you've got one point of contact. So a bundled offering gives our members an enhanced set of services to meet their individual needs and objectives. We've moved over Tamika and Cindy, who will be joining me in 2 minutes as part of our team. So now we can support our members through every step of the process, through plan adoption, implementation, admin, investment, benefit communication, and participant communications. Nothing's changed other than 2 of our consultants moving over under the Homestead funds and our entire team now, one team that's experienced and knowledgeable, providing a solutions-based approach. What does it mean? What are the top 5 benefits? Really, it's a bundled service to co-ops, but most importantly, it's about attracting and retaining talent. And that's what we're here to talk to you about. What can we do in this competitive labor market to perhaps have an edge by offering a deferred compensation program? You can attract talent, you can retain talent, and you can compensate talent through a DC program. It motivates your top talent, it aligns benefits with well-established NRECA plans. We can simplify plan adoption, implementation, compliance, and most of all, communicate with your participants. Those are the people that are going to benefit from a DC plan. I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Tamika and Cindy, who are now part of RE Advisors from the INFS team. And they will talk to you a little bit about what they do and how they can help. So with that, Cindy, Tamika, all yours.
Thank you for that intro, Mark. I know that there are a lot of people listening in today and that they're already familiar with Cindy and myself. And so for those who may not be, we want to help get more familiar with us and the Deferred Compensation Unit. And as Mark mentioned, I am Tamika Bishop, half of the Deferred Compensation team. And as I start, I first want to point out that Cindy and I today will be speaking to the 457B plan and the Executive Benefit Restoration Plan that are administered by tax-exempt co-ops only. So if there happens to be any taxable co-ops among us interested in learning more about how their co-op can benefit or their employees can benefit, we're more than happy to schedule a time to meet with you beyond this webinar. Taxable co-ops can benefit from non-qualified deferred compensation plans. However, there's some slightly different rules and notes that you want to take note of. And last, for the record, I also want to mention that non-qualified deferred compensation plans are used, as Mark said, to attract, retain, and or reward key employees. And catch this, are 100% sponsored and administered by the cooperative. Sometimes there's a little confusion there. In designing a 457B plan or any deferred compensation plan, your first step is determining who's eligible to participate. Participants must belong to a select group of management or be highly compensated employees who play a role in the strategic and or financial direction of the cooperative. Typically, most co-ops will draw a line in their organizational chart to define those eligible positions. If you look here, the sample chart shows 8 positions that are highlighted in yellow that would be deemed eligible. And you can see all of those are holding titles of a vice president or above. This designation would be appropriate and reasonable for a cooperative with, let's say, 100 employees or so. But if you had a smaller co-op of, let's say, 35 employees, it would be difficult to rationalize a group of that size. And you might want to identify only the CEO and maybe 1 or 2 other individuals that would be eligible. The latitude for sponsoring these plans is really far and wide. The plan sponsors are the ones who determine the methodology, but it's again important to note that you have to designate that small select group of employees. And that's how you mitigate any compliance concerns with the goals of keeping it from looking like a qualified plan. The key really is to have a documented basis for determining eligibility. And we all go by or use best practices. So a best practice here would be to document eligibility in your employee handbook or some sort of HR procedural guide, because there are rare cases where you could be audited by the IRS or the Department of Labor. If you have that transparent documented process, it can make an audit run much more smoothly for you. Now, what you're looking at here is the basic features of the 457B plan for tax-exempt employers. And we don't want to confuse this with the very popular 457B governmental plans that are sponsored by local and municipal governments. But this plan allows for employees as well as employers to defer income over and above the typical 401k plan offerings. There are many scenarios that might lead anybody towards adopting a plan because it's very attractive and beneficial for both the cooperative and executives. We'll take a look at a few cases here shortly, but in 2022, the plan contribution limit is $20,500 per eligible employee. And so that's going to be as it relates to the employee deferral as well as any company contribution going towards that. This amount increases every couple of years to adjust for inflation, very similarly to how other retirement plans work. This plan also has a notable special catch-up option that allows a one-time election to defer additional dollars during the 3 years prior to the years of a participant's normal retirement age. So for those who will have a dominant retirement or pension plan, typically we use the retirement security plan because that's what's most popular for our group. It would be that normal retirement age. So for example, age 62 or 65, that would be the age that one could catch up prior to that year. Cindy and I help cooperatives. We consult with them to make sure that if this is something that a participant wants to do, that we can assist them with figuring out what that catch-up would be. Another major feature is that all contributions are immediately vested, which means there is no specific employment time period or obligation that must elapse before a participant can receive full benefits. So once a participant separates employment, funds may be distributed in the manners that they initially elected on the election form, which is something that's filled out when they enroll in the plan. And it's also taxable in that year that they receive it. Now, although contributions are immediately vested, it's important to note that until a distribution occurs, the assets are owned by the cooperative. We want our participants to know that because there's just that little amount of risk of understanding that in the event of a bankruptcy or an insolvency, that assets are subject to creditors. When it comes to taking the money, making a distribution, there are 3 available options for participants. A single lump sum, installments over time. I've typically seen 36 months or 5 years, or a combination of those two. But because this program is a retirement program, we frequently are asked if participants can roll over these funds to another retirement vehicle, such as a 401k or an IRA. This is not allowed because it's not considered qualified money, and we cannot commingle qualified with non-qualified assets. Let's take a look at our cases. We're going to be seeing this on the next 3 slides. We'll look at first how these particular plans can help cooperatives meet the needs by restoring relatively small executive benefit amounts to those that would otherwise be restricted. In this first case, we can see that they're the CEO and the CFO of ABC Participant. We were really original with naming our cooperative. There are participants that participate in the 401k plan. However, they end up receiving large refund checks each year due to the co-op failing annual non-discrimination testing. anytime a co-op fails these tests, it immediately affects those that are the highest income earners within the co-op. This plan can restore contribution amounts limited by the 401k by allowing the executive the ability to contribute up to $20,500 in 2022. The co-op can also contribute an amount that would restore any losses of the 401k matching contributions. And again, that's up to the $20,500. So that's a combined amount. But remember, unlike a 401k, 457B plans, assets always belong to the cooperative until distribution, which we again recognize that they occur only at separation of employment of that eligible participant. Our second case for the 457B plan, it's used to restore contributions limited by the IRS contribution limits. And some of these words are going to sound very technical, but Cindy and I can help walk you through this. The IRS contribution limit for this year happens to be $305,000. That means that any benefits that would have otherwise been earned above that amount would be restricted. This example shows that the CEO of any town earns $500,000 a year and participates in a 401k plan, and let's assume offers a 4% employer matching contribution. Because her compensation is capped at $305,000 this year, she is restricted from contributing $7,800 as well as receiving an employer matching contribution of $7,800 for a total of $15,600 in a given year. That's a pretty big chunk of change to miss out on deferring as well as receiving, don't you think? Like in case one, this plan can allow benefits that would otherwise be restricted to be restored. And then in our third case, we're going to look at how it could help restore any limitations to the retirement security plan. Most of you are probably familiar with the retirement security plan and over the years have become aware that there are several restrictions to be had. At this lucky co-op, the CFO earns $310,000 a year, and it has been estimated that he will have a $50,000 restriction in the RS plan benefits when he retires in 5 years. Given this is a relatively small amount to what we see, the 457B plan can be used to allow the co-op to make contributions to restore the full benefit amount over time. The caveat here is that any benefits earned within the plan are immediately vested, so there's no real incentive for the executive to stay for any period of time or specific to the plan once funds are contributed. This is where an annual funding approach might make the most sense versus funding all up front, any given amount, or contributing all up in the first couple of years. But note that if the co-op contributes the full annual contribution amount in any year, the participant will not be able to make deferrals. So we just want to understand that in these plans, the $20,500 limit is all that can be contributed in 2022. Needless to say, there are many scenarios that come up and warrant the need and the use of the 457B plan or other types of non-deferred compensation plans. Hopefully, these three cases bring some clarity as to how they can help you attract, retain, and reward employees. Now I'm turning it over to you, Cindy, to speak on the Executive Benefit Restoration Plan.
Thanks, Tamika. I'm just going to put in a plug real quickly for the 457B plan before I start talking about the EBR. It's our most common non-qualified plan that we offer, and that's primarily because it's very inexpensive and very easy to administer. And it's a really excellent plan for when you're really trying to attract good key employees. It's a nice benefit to have added on. So if you don't have a plan or you have a plan that's not very active right now, Tamika and I would be happy to help you set one up. Again, very quick to do and very inexpensive, especially if the co-op is not going to be making any contributions, which is quite common, just to give your senior executives the ability to save more for retirement or whatever their goal is. So the 457B is a great solution. It's a very common and very popular plan, and Tamika and I are always available to help set it up and to actually educate your participants, because we find that in many times in these plans that even if the plan is already available, people don't participate because they really don't understand how the plan works. That's our job, to do that for you. That's my little advertisement for the 457B plan. Our second most common active plan is our executive benefit restoration plan. And the key word here is restoration. What these plans are designed to do is to restore restrictions in the retirement security plan that are put into place, not by NRECA, not by the co-op, but because the IRS limits benefits that can be calculated and then taken out of the plan. There's basically two limits, one of which Tamika already referred to. One is the salary limit. There's a salary amount of $305,000, or compensation amount of $305,000 right now this year, that you can only earn that much of a match in the 401k, as she mentioned. But also when the RS plan, the Retirement Security Defined Benefit Plan calculation is made, if someone makes, say, $500,000, their benefit formula is going to be years of service times their high five salary, limited to that 305 or whatever it has been. The limits have been throughout their employment, and times your benefit level. So essentially what happens is somebody comes into a co-op thinking they're going to get a certain benefit formula when they retire, and the benefit formula is restricted by the IRS. That's the salary limit. There's something else which I won't go into all the details on, that the IRS limits the benefit that can be taken out of an RS plan, a defined benefit pension plan. And those are what are known as the 415 limits. Many of you may be subject to those or have heard of those. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details because it's pretty much of a black box, but suffice it to say that they are driven primarily by interest rates. And in our current low interest rate environment, it has created a situation where a number of folks have had a large gap in that pension benefit formula that I just mentioned. And what ends up happening is somebody has been promised a certain formula and a certain benefit, and they're not able to receive it out of their RS plan. The plan that we offer that can help restore that benefit, and also to make a promise to somebody new who may be coming on that they will receive their full pension benefit, is through this executive benefit restoration plan. And we like to talk in tax codes here in this business. These plans are set up under section 457F, not B, so they are different from the B plan. And these plans are 100% employer funded, and there are no employee contributions allowed or expected. The main thing is that there are no maximum contribution or benefit limits, as with the 457B that Tamika was just referring to. Essentially, the benefit could be unlimited, of course, limited by the amount that a co-op can fit into their budget. These plans also are not immediately vested like the 457B, but they are subject to what's known as a substantial risk of forfeiture, which means there has to be some sort of date in the future where these benefits are promised. It has to be at least 24 months in the future, and more typically the vesting date for these benefits are going to be set coincident with the RS plan normal retirement date or normal retirement age, since that is the point of which the restriction is actually recognized. These plans, they're lovely for replacing a restriction, but a lot of times the way they're paid out isn't as attractive to folks. But the way these plans work is when they vest, they must be paid out and they must be taxed. If somebody is receiving one of these benefits while they're still working, perhaps at quasi-retirement, they're going to end up getting taxed. And unfortunately, that often means at a higher tax rate, since it's built on top of the salary they've earned for that year. As Tamika already pointed out, non-qualified plans, you can't redefer them, you can't roll them over. So unfortunately, although these plans are great for replacing a benefit restriction, they have tax consequences that aren't as attractive as if the benefit had come out of the defined benefit or the RS plan. And finally, just other deferred compensation, the assets are always owned by the co-op, and so they're always at risk of that financial stress in the event of financial stress or bankruptcy. Can we go to the next slide, please? Before we quickly move into some case studies on how to creatively use that EBR or Executive Benefit Restoration Plan, I want to talk quickly about an old plan that some of you may know about or may even be participants in, the Pension Restoration Plan. That just to highlight, that plan is no longer available. It was frozen in 2014, so no new participants since then. And those that are still in the plan, of course, are still participants and are using the structure of that plan. The thing to understand about the PRP was that it is a one-size-fits-all plan, meaning that Anybody who has the plan has had the same plan document, the same calculation of the benefit restriction. So it's a very one-size-fits-all. Everybody is treated the same. In this day and age, trying to attract quality people, there's a need for more flexibility. The PRP also was a plan that was billed through the RS plan, and if somebody left before they actually hit their vesting date, any RS billings, and these were billings on the actual salaries instead of the limited salary, the PRP actually in your RS bill, those that are participants are billed for their actual salary, that $500,000 versus the $305,000. And so if those payments had been made in over time and somebody left before their vesting date, those resources are not recoverable. But in an EBR, the EBR plan that we set up was specifically to make these plans much more flexible for co-ops to use. It's a standalone benefit that is provided by the co-op, sponsored by the co-op, and financed by the co-op. So in the event where somebody does not meet their vesting date, any resources that have been set aside can be reclaimed by the co-op. The bottom line is that the PRP was the old plan. It doesn't exist anymore, but the EBR does exist, and it is set up specifically to allow for flexibility to build a plan around your co-op's budget and your executive compensation needs. So next slide, please. Let's look at a couple of cases quickly. This is a situation, we're back to that ABC co-op where the CEO and the CFO are highly compensated. They have a benefit restriction either through 415 or because their salaries are higher, estimated to be about $500,000. Just as an aside, if you're wondering how they know they're restricted, typically this is the perfect time of year to be talking about it when the RS statements come out. Through NRECA, their Insurance and Financial Services Group, there is actually a person who monitors the statements and makes sure that folks are notified if they're at risk of being restricted by 415. So back to ABC Co-op, we have the CEO and the CFO. And here's a situation where the CEO has been with the co-op for her whole career. The CFO has only been there 5 years. The board has a limited budget for executive compensation, and they want to replace the benefits lost, but they're not sure that they can afford it. The flexibility of the EBR allows the plan to perhaps restore all of the CEO's benefits, since she's been there her whole career, and restore partially the CFO's restriction for the years at ABC Co-op only. Ideally, if they were using the PRP, that wouldn't be the case. As I said, one size fits all, and both would have to be fully restored. In this case, you've got the flexibility for the board to choose wisely or choose how they want to use their resources. The board could choose to cap the benefit. They could also choose to restore only a certain component of the restriction. The salary versus the salary over the 415 tends to be the choice in the situation there, because the 415 is driven by so many external factors, especially interest rates. Next slide, please. In this case, what this co-op decided to do is fully restore the CEO. The whole idea was she came in, she served her whole career there, she expected to get her full benefit formula, and that's what the board decided to do. The CFO, while has a similar restriction, because that restriction was only earned 5 years or perhaps a few years later at ABC, the board will agree to restore him at the same level, but only using the years of service at their own cooperative. It's just a flexible way, a creative way to restore the service to the participants and the services they've specifically provided to that co-op. I should say that this situation, the numbers for these plans are unknown, because the calculation is not, the exact amount of the restriction is not known until the final high five salaries and interest rates are known. And because these are standalone plans, as I mentioned, and they are the co-op's liability, that in situations like this, when a restoration agreement, plan is put in place and the numbers are unknown, then each year we help provide through a report called the ASC 715. We're working on these right now to provide to your auditors such that the liability for the promised benefits will show up on your balance sheet each year. The point here is that the co-op can use their budgeted dollars in this situation as they see fit. They can treat people differently. In qualified plans, as you cannot do that. And in non-qualified plans, that's exactly the whole point. Can we move to the next slide, please? Second case study, this is a smaller co-op, maybe 30 employees. They have a nice benefit level, but they have a small staff, and the CEO was recently notified that his benefit will be limited under Section 415. The board feels like they're already offering a very generous retirement benefit, and they really don't feel comfortable with an undetermined future liability, and nor do they feel comfortable handling the more complex nature of the ASC 715 that needs to be completed. So what they might do, using the flexibility of the EBR, is to set up more of a defined contribution approach where they agree with the CEO on the amount that's reasonable to restore. Tamika and I can work with the actuaries and run some numbers looking at certain level of interest rates, certain level of salaries, come up with a high-low. For instance, in this situation, maybe the high-low is $300,000 to $600,000. Perhaps this co-op would agree to restore $450,000, or I should say as a target or a benchmark. And instead of having an unknown liability in the future, the plan would be set up to make annual contributions towards that benchmark, towards that $450,000. Next slide, please. So what ends up happening is the CEO gets a restoration benefit. It could end up being more or less, and certainly probably won't be the exact actual restriction at his or her vesting or retirement date. Who knows what the investment performance will be, and you don't know what interest rates will be. So the idea is that they agree upon a number that seems reasonable, and the deposits are made. The board does not have to be concerned with an unknown liability. There's no need to account for it in a special way because there's deposits being made to an account. And what we've often seen in this situation, we've seen this most commonly with co-ops that have younger CEOs or younger C-suite folks who may not want to wait or may not feel like they're going to spend their entire career at one co-op, as people have done in the past. And the fact that they can see a balance, they can see deposits going into their account, it makes it feel a little more tangible than just a sheet of paper that says, oh, at some point in time, you will receive this restoration benefit. The person feels like they're more in control, and they see the account balance, and it makes them feel more comfortable. The point here is that, again, the EBR can be very flexible. The co-op can budget for annual payments. It's very simplified. They don't have to account for the liability in a special way. Small co-op can use their budget dollars wisely and not overburden their staff with the slightly more complexity of the EBR plan. Next slide. The EBR can be used to actually not necessarily restore just the IRS restricted benefits, but it can be used to help recruit a new CEO or a new C-suite person to make them feel comfortable that they're replicating benefits they had at their previous employer. In this situation, we've got Lucky Co-op, who's maybe not so lucky right now because their CEO is leaving and they're seeking to hire a new CEO. And the co-op is in a great setting and they have great benefits, but they really are looking for somebody who has very specific experience in broadband because that's their newest strategic initiative. They found the perfect person, but unfortunately his current co-op has an RS plan benefit level of 2% versus Lucky's benefit level of 1.5%. So there's a 5% differential. He's 10 years from retirement, and so he just doesn't feel comfortable giving up that higher benefit level. Rather than restoring an IRS restricted benefit, that you can use the EBR to restore an RS benefit, to create essentially that supplemental 0.5% that he's giving up so that he can make an apples to apples comparison when he compares one offer to another. So the EBR is used to replace that 0.5% difference. Another way you could do this, of course, is to just raise everybody's benefit level to 2.0% to match his. But unfortunately, I think everybody knows that's a very expensive proposition, because that means in a qualified plan, which the RS is, you have to treat everybody the same. So that would be much more expensive than treating it this way. And so what's the result? The result is that the CEO feels like he's not leaving money on the table, so to speak. If he takes the new job, his benefit has been restored, his RS benefit has been restored. Our actuarial team completes the calculation at the time of his vesting date and the time he reaches either quasi or full retirement when there's a payment event. And the CEO will get the 1.5% like other employees straight from the RS plan, but the 0.5% he will be paid at his vesting date, the remaining 0.5% to make him whole compared to his previous co-op. Now, we can all immediately jump to the thought, I'm sure, that this has different taxation. If it comes out of the RS plan, it can be rolled over and taxed over time. That's not the way these plans work, obviously. So the co-op could set up, using one of Tamika's ideas, to set up a 457B plan, perhaps after the vesting date, where they could make deposits to it to potentially try to make the tax consequences be less substantial for this participant. Again, both these plans are very flexible and they can be used to meet your needs. And our objective and our reason, our job, Tamika and I, is to help you figure out what you need, what your objectives are, what your budget is, and how we can use either of these plans. Or we actually have a third plan that's sort of somewhere in between a 457B performance incentive plan that can be used to handle other non-restrictions that are not related, or incentive plans that are unrelated to the RS plan. We have a number of products, a number of arrows in our quiver, and our job is to work with you and help you find what is going to be the best deferred compensation plan or plans to meet your co-op's needs. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark and see if we have any questions, or if we have time for questions.
I think we're going to hold off on questions. If you did submit a question, we will get back to you. First and foremost, thank you, Tamika and Cindy. If you have questions or would like to speak with us about deferred comp, reach out to Cindy and Tamika. If you have any questions on the funds or on our economic outlook or our investment capabilities, please reach out to me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. We will have our next webinar in our series coming up in the spring after the first quarter, and it'll be fun to see how our outlook is holding up given the markets. So buckle up, stay tuned, and we hope everybody has a great year, and we look forward to our next Connect. Take care.